Education freedom is important, because it's making sure that we're recognizing every student has their own unique way of learning. And if they're going to learn best and achieve the most in their local public school, we think that's great. And parents should absolutely send their child to that public school, and the funding should stay with that public school. But there are going to be kids who would learn better in a virtual school or in a homeschool. We want to make sure that those options are still realistic possibilities for those families, especially low-income families.
The American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, last year released a report that ranks Louisiana 14th in the nation when it comes to education freedom. ALEC is a group of state legislators dedicated to conservative principles like limited government, free markets, and federalism. Andrew Handel is with ALEC and directs its Education and Workforce Development Task Force. He joins us now. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
To start with, what do you mean by education freedom?
Yeah, so education freedom is simply making sure that we're empowering parents and families to access as many different educational options as possible, whether that's public school, private school, homeschool, virtual school, whatever choice it may be. It's basically just recognizing that every student learns in their own way, and we want to make sure that those unique learning needs are being taken care of.
And what factors did you look at exactly when you ranked the states?
Yeah, so we looked at 5 scoring categories. The first is funding and financing, which is where we take a look at tax credit scholarship programs, voucher programs, education savings account programs, and we rank those in the states that have them. The second category we looked at was charter schools. The third category was homeschools. The fourth was virtual schools. And then last but not least, we had open enrollment, which is basically your public school choice. That's, kind of the term we use for making sure that students can access a public school, not just the one that they're geographically assigned to, whether it's inside of their school district or outside of their district.
And the report gives Louisiana a C letter grade, but ranks 14th in the nation. Can you explain what went into that ranking, what it means?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Louisiana was ranked 14th in this report, which is very good. But there's still a lot of work to do. The state scored fairly average in the virtual schools and open enrollment categories. The biggest issue we saw with Louisiana was the funding and financing area. The state has a couple of programs it takes right now, but they're fairly limited in terms of which students can access them, and the amount of money that's given to the students through scholarships is a fraction of what a public school would otherwise spend.
What would an A score look like? What would Louisiana have to do to score an A? You mentioned the funding and financing.
Yeah. Yeah. The biggest thing there is, having universal programs in place. We've got 10 states now in just the past 2 years or so have passed universal programs. Many of those universal education savings account programs, which are kind of the gold standard in education freedom policy. Those allow families to spend the money not just on private school tuition, but also on instructional materials or therapies for a student with special needs or standardized testing fees. The list goes on and on. So, making sure that, there's a program like that in place for all students in the state would definitely go a long way towards maximizing education freedom in Louisiana.
So back to the basic question here. In Alec's opinion, why is education freedom, as you call it, important?
Yeah, education freedom is important, because it's making sure that we're recognizing every student has their own unique way of learning. And if they're going to learn best and achieve the most in their local public school, we think that's great. And parents should absolutely send their child to that public school, and the funding should stay with that public school. But there are going to be kids who would learn better in a virtual school or in a homeschool. We want to make sure that those options are still realistic possibilities for those families, especially low-income families.
We're speaking with Andrew Handel with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. We're talking about its State Education Freedom Index. Andrew, tell me your response to some of the criticisms of some of these programs that put forward this idea of school choice. What about the role of traditional public schools? The programs you're talking about use public dollars to fund selective education for a limited number of families, often private education for just select families. In practice, they take money away from public schools, which in some parts of the country, including many places in Louisiana, is the only form of education that children have access to. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I would say that, especially in the areas where the public school might be the only choice, families who continue to send their kids to public schools, the money still stays with that public school. Basically, the core concept of education freedom is making sure that the funds are following the student, not the system. So we don't just want to be sending the dollars, straight to a public school when the student isn't going to be taught in that public school. So also, there's a couple of different pots of money that we look at. So usually when we're talking about education and savings account programs or tax credit scholarships, it's only the state portion of funding for education that's actually going to follow the student to whatever educational environment is best for them. The local money, and in most cases, federal money, still stays with the public school, even though the student is no longer there. So in practice, what we actually see is total funding per pupil goes up when we have more participation in these programs, because some of that money still stays behind with the public school, even though the student is no longer being taught there.
Would you say that education freedom is possible without publicly funded private education?
I would say that education freedom is possible when we've got all options available to families. We mentioned the example of low income families who might have a student who would succeed the most in a private school nearby. We're going to advocate for making sure that state education dollars follow that student.
Especially here in the South, after years of desegregation and the rise of private schools and choice schools like charters and magnets, we have research now that points to some negative impacts for disadvantaged students who remain in schools that effectively remain segregated, schools drained of the more advantaged students. What solution do you think there would be to this darker side of school choice?
Yeah, well, I think actually most studies find positive impacts, from education freedom programs. And, especially when we're not limiting these policies to certain groups of students. So, that's ultimately how we make sure that these are, going to help disadvantaged students, low income students.
You mentioned those studies about the outcomes for students when they're involved in school choice programs, those school quality concerns. Switching here to Louisiana, the Louisiana Scholarship Program, they had evaluations that found voucher participants on average scored lower than their peers in public schools on the state test, especially in math. So these performance metrics don't look like a universal truth with school choice nationwide necessarily. What do you say to school quality concerns like that? What measures should be in place to make sure the students actually perform better?
Yeah, no, I would say, the biggest thing is making sure that these programs are available to all students. That's really the thing that we center our focus on. When it comes to Louisiana's voucher program, they've actually got two voucher programs right now, as well as one tax credit scholarship program, the tuition donation program. Each of those is very limited in terms of who can participate. The tax credit scholarship, just 45% of families are eligible in the state for that. The Student Scholarships for Educational Excellence program, just 35% of families are eligible. And then the school choice program for certain students with exceptionalities, just 11%. And in each of these, the average scholarship value is just 35% of what the average public school would spend on teaching that student. This is only the state portion of money that's following the student, not the local and the federal funds.
Speaking more to Louisiana policy, Louisiana lawmakers plan to reintroduce legislation regarding education savings accounts, ESAs, in the coming session, bills that previously failed or were vetoed by Governor John Bel Edwards. What policies do you think the state should approve, and what safeguards, if any, do you think they should include to address some of those concerns?
Sure. Yeah. Well, obviously, universal ESAs are the gold standard in education freedom. So we definitely recommend that the legislature pursue that as a policy. Outside of that, you mentioned accountability. We've had some really good results with these programs in other states. Arizona, for example, finding that less than 1% of total ESA funds there are misspent. So, so far we've seen really strong accountability.
Did any states score an A in this ranking?
Yeah, so we had three states score an A. We had Florida, Arkansas, and Indiana were the three that scored an A. So there's a common theme there. Each of them have universal education freedom programs, and then they've, got really strong policies in place to make sure that all families can access all forms of education, whether that's public school, private school, homeschool, virtual school, whatever that might be.
Andrew Handel directs ALEC's Education and Workforce Development Task Force, which released its State Education Freedom Index. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me.